Breath of the Wild was and is a great game. Very few excel in game design the same way Breath of the Wild did, and it's a must-play for every single gamer, no matter what. However, does that mean it's a good Zelda game? Well, that's a tough question. Zelda as a franchise has been around since 1986, and even from the start, there were many defining characteristics that set it apart from any other game, and tied future Zeldas all together. For example, from the very start, exploration and the journey of seeing the world for the first time was essential. Miyamoto built the game off of his childhood experience of exploring forests and caves. Back then, there were no tutorials and very few guides. And that's shown in Legend of Zelda from its design and the limits of the period. Although you could beat the game in 2 hours if you knew what you were doing, back in the 90s, you'd be spending all of your summer trying to figure it out. By future titles, it became less cryptic, but the exploration never wavered. Now, if we look at Breath of the Wild, should we even question the idea of exploration in the game? It's 90% of the entire game, and it was practically built as a fully realized version of Zelda NES. If you argue that Breath of the Wild's exploration isn't Zelda, then I just have to say you're wrong. Although, exploration isn't the only thing that makes something Zelda. If that were the case, then any Metroid, Fallout, or even Mario could be considered a Zelda type. So what else might make something Zelda? Back to the original, there was another staple that set it apart from many other games, and that was its 9 dungeons and bosses. Even nowadays, Zelda NES still has some of the greatest bosses and dungeons around. There's a reason most of the first enemies and bosses still exist in newer games. And if we just go forward a few years, we can see the bosses and dungeons getting even better in A Link to the Past and Link's Awakening. Zelda is truly built off of having amazing dungeons. Now, did Breath of the Wild satisfy that? Now, if you asked me this a month ago, I think I would have said absolutely not. But I've spent a bit of time thinking about this very thing, and honestly, I'm not sure. I absolutely think prior games were better with each dungeon having a unique design and atmosphere, but I think for what Breath of the Wild was, the dungeons worked. And really, you shouldn't complain when you have 120 extra bonus mini dungeons with at least half of them being really fun. Now, I'm still going to be much happier with fully fledged dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom, but I've expected and come to appreciate what Breath of the Wild did. Breath of the Wild's 4 Divine Beasts were very different from prior dungeons, but each did offer unique puzzles and themes. In Vah Meadow, for example, much of the dungeon is spent manipulating wind and flight to solve puzzles or even to maneuver. And then in the case of Vah Rudania, you start in complete darkness, and all throughout the dungeon you need to find ways to use or avoid fire. I think it's unfair to say Breath of the Wild didn't offer unique dungeons, and although I'll never consider the Divine Beasts to be the best dungeons in Zelda history, I know I won't ignore them when I next play Breath of the Wild. But next is truly what I think is the defining difference between Breath of the Wild and all other Zelda games. A great dungeon is only ever as good as the tools you use in it. And in prior Zeldas, those tools were the dozens of items you would receive in each dungeon. And that's been seen in every Zelda up until Breath of the Wild, with staples like the hookshot, bomb bag, and bow. And in Breath of the Wild, they outright removed much of this mechanic and replaced it with runes or just finding these items from enemies or shops. For example, rather than a magic wand received in a dungeon, you could get the meteor rod from defeating Wizrobes. And then the whole elemental arrow and magic meter situation was replaced by finding ice, fire, or bomb arrows in chests and shops. The entire item system was overhauled in Breath of the Wild. And the dungeons are each built off the 4 runes given at the very start of the game, rather than any specific items. This was more negative for the game than helpful. In past games, each dungeon was built off a single item and made even the most absurd items useful. So does Breath of the Wild's new system make it not Zelda? There's some Zelda fans who might consider this to be the breaking point, and to an extent, I think they're right. Items have been treated the same since the very beginning, and it's hard to accept that in this game they just completely dropped the system. But I still don't believe that makes this game not Zelda. The lack of any special items like in the past makes this game feel different, but when it comes down to the details, it still feels like Zelda. Maybe it's because of Link, Zelda, the Great Deku Tree, or even just the name, but it still feels like Zelda. I might be tempted to say that this is only because of some strange psychology tied to the name of the game or the art style, but I'm no expert in that, and I don't need to be. This feels like a Zelda game through and through. Not just because of the endless exploration and the dungeons, but because of the feel. I've always had a connected feeling when I'm playing Minish Cap, Twilight Princess, and Breath of the Wild that I didn't feel when playing different Zelda-like games such as Tunic. Tunic is a great game from what I've played, but it doesn't feel like Zelda. I would love to give an easy solution like it's just the music used, but it's not that simple. Breath of the Wild has many differences from what might make something Zelda on paper, but in action, I don't think there's anything that could be more Zelda. So for me, I would have to say Breath of the Wild isn't only a good Zelda game, but it's the perfect Zelda. And if you don't think so, tell me why. Just keep it classy. Breath of the Wild strayed greatly from some of the best Zelda cliches, and I know classic Zelda fans were disappointed by that, but I've accepted it, even if I know that it's very unlikely now that we'll ever get a classic 3D Zelda again. I have a lot I need to say about that topic specifically because who really knows what's to come next, but I'll keep that video on hold until I've seen much of Tears of the Kingdom. And that's where I'm going to end it. Tears of the Kingdom isn't even 2 days away at the time of this upload, and it's going to be the defining example of what to expect from the Zelda formula from now on. I hope to see you in the coming days because there's no time better than the present for a Nintendo fan, and I hope that you'll show up here too. Until then, always keep cool.